am I? I could be anyone.
Rango is a brilliant exploration of identity. One thing you're gonna hear from every writing teacher is that your protagonist needs to be an active part of the narrative. They need to have a clear goal that they aim to achieve by the end of the film, and a reason why they aim to achieve that. Rango doesn't really have any of those, and yet it creates an extremely compelling character study with the backdrop of a postmodern western. The film starts with a protagonist trying to perform and direct a film within the confines of his enclosure with a few of the toys his owners gave him, as he begins to question whether the character he's playing, the protagonist, the hero, is undefined.
My character's undefined? That's absurd. I know who I am. I'm the guy, the protagonist, the hero.
To try to answer the question,
Who am I?
he doesn't start listing characteristics of the character he created for his little film. He simply says,
I could be anyone.
and starts acting out scenarios of different protagonists he could be. What the film is doing here is telling us who Rango is by not telling us who he is. Rango himself doesn't know who he is, so he learns he's someone without an identity. As someone who's always lived inside his enclosure, he doesn't have any bearing on who he is in relation to the world or other people.
I don't see no friends.
Well,
You are a very lonely lizard.
You ever get lonely?
sometimes.
So his way to try to search for that is acting out these films, to try to get a sense of identity. With that, Rango realizes he can't know who he is if he doesn't face conflict, if he stays inside his little bubble. Obviously, he's saying that in relation to his character, that he needs to write conflict for his character to overcome, so through that adversity, his character can learn who he is, which is why the following line is perfect in many ways.
I've had an epiphany. The hero cannot exist in a vacuum. What our story needs is an ironic, unexpected event that will propel the hero into conflict.
As I mentioned, this is a postmodern film, so it's very meta, and the self-referential nature of it, that's very reminiscent of Dan Harmon's work in Rick and Morty and Community,
It's a story device, literally.
adds a lot to this search for identity the character faces, because the film itself is a search for identity. Considering it's a typical Western that is searching for its own identity to set itself apart from all the other Western films that were made in abundance in the 50s and 60s, while also paying homage to them. With that, Rango gets thrust in this adventure, where he's told he's supposed to go through it, but neither the character nor the audience knows why, and that's by design.
I'm walking into the desert. Alone.
We all have our journeys to make.
The film wants you to be reluctant here, because we know how much the protagonist lacks in skills for surviving real and dangerous situations. And he knows it too. He's trying to avoid any real conflict because he's too scared, which follows very clearly the story beats of the hero's journey, as does the rest of the film, as is consistent with its meta way of storytelling. And so, despite his reservations, he goes anyway in search of water. When he's put in dangerous situations such as running away from the hawk, he doesn't get out of it through skill, it's by luck. Both here and later in the film when the hawk runs after him in the town, as well as the canyon chase scene, Rango gets away because of luck, paired with his own quick thinking in these high-stress situations, but his actions are never tied to being Rango the gunslinger. They're tied with him running away from trouble and thinking on his feet as to how to avoid danger, rather than overcome it. What this story does is the classic story of someone pretending to be someone they're not, to trick people into treating them better, until they find out the character was lying to them, and then the character does something noble to win back their trust. It's a simple writing tool, but that works really well for films about a search for identity, and, considering this film is very meta, it fits especially well here, because Rango isn't pretending to be someone that already exists, like the classic comedy trope of a character getting mistaken for someone else and living that person's life. What this film does is that Rango pretends to be the version of himself he wants to be. He wants to be the hero, the person who everyone in this town respects, the sheriff in a western, as Rango uses his knowledge of films to create this persona, to a point where we hadn't heard his name before he chooses the name Rango for himself, because that's a clear way to show Rango didn't have an identity for himself until he got there. And then he pretended to be this legendary outlaw called Rango, the same way he was playing a character in his films. What the film then does is have Rango fail repeatedly, but hide it from the townspeople and pretend like he's on top of things, making him not an active part of the story, just a passive agent that experiences the story. That is, until we finally get the second act low point of Rattlesnake Jake, this legendary gunslinger that's been mentioned time and time again in the film, show up and expose Rango's lies.
You didn't kill them Jenkins brothers. You ain't even from the West, are you? All you've done is lie to these good people. You ain't nothing but a fake and a coward.
This all leads to Rango having an existential crisis.
Who am I? I'm nobody.
He'd created this identity for himself, not only to survive in this town, but because it's who he wanted to be. However, the first moment he's faced with real adversity by Rattlesnake Jake, he folds and can't kill him. He's not the gunslinging outlaw he claimed he was, and he doesn't have the courage to do the things that define him and his identity. With that, Rango lets go of the sheriff badge and walks into the desert, knowing he failed to protect these people who believed him, because he gave them hope of a better tomorrow.
Believe in that there sign. For as long as it hangs there, we got hope.
And so, Rango walks towards the road mentioned earlier by the mentor figure of the story.
That was you crossing the road? Why'd you do that?
This is my quest. It's not so easy as it looks.
What?
It's a metaphor.
And this time, no car hits him. The metaphor here is the death and rebirth part of the hero's journey. As Rango loses his sense of identity once again, he dies. He walks into the road, and that's his death. He has no reason to continue because he failed on his journey. He didn't actually become a better person after going through these adversities. However, his rebirth comes from talking to the spirit of the West, which is obviously an homage to Clint Eastwood, which works on a meta level for the film that's been paying homage to Westerns to have the most iconic figure in Western cinema be the spirit of the West, but also for Rango himself, as his idea of who he wanted to be came from the films he watched before losing that previous life. So he'd obviously see Clint Eastwood as the spirit of the West.
You came a long way to find something that isn't out here. It's not about you. It's about them.
Here, Rango finally realizes who he is.
But I can't go back.
No man can walk out on his own story.
It doesn't matter if he's loved by the people or not. It doesn't matter if he has the guts to face Rattlesnake Jake or not. What matters is the townspeople, and that he has to save them, because of the hope he gave them. In his search for identity, Rango was trying to act like someone that isn't him, but, as the spirit of the West puts it,
Doesn't matter what they call you. It's the deeds make the man.
Rango doesn't have to pretend to be someone else. He can be Rango, Sheriff of Dirt, without lying about his history and pretending he has the guts to face Rattlesnake Jake. With that, he walks back to Dirt, picks up the sheriff badge again, as we see the sheriff sign still hanging, which is my favorite detail from this film because even though the sign was destroyed by Rattlesnake Jake, and so was Rango's sense of identity,
Believe in that there sign. For as long as it hangs there, we got hope.
the sign still hangs, showing that they do indeed have hope. Rango's plan as he comes back to Dirt isn't to have this classic Mexican standoff, but to use his ingenuity and knowledge to defeat Rattlesnake Jake and the mayor and expose their plan, showing he now does have the guts to stand up to those two, which he didn't earlier, because he figured out who he is. He's the defender of this town, because of everything the people from that town did to him, as they fulfilled his search for identity. And so, for the first time in the film, he's an active part of the story. He's the one who saves the town, which was crafted masterfully in structure to have this be the case, as the act of Rattlesnake Jake destroying the sheriff's sign earlier was the
Ironic, unexpected event that will propel the hero into conflict.
Considering Rango's own search for identity is what caused his own loss of identity, the irony of causing his own downfall. So the story comes full circle as we realize that Rango only faced real conflict once he returned to Dirt without the water and Rattlesnake Jake came after him. Before that, he didn't have a story until he was propelled into conflict, not only to face the mayor, who'd been playing him for a fool the entire film, but also to face the inner conflict of figuring out who he is.
Name's Rango.
And finally, we can see that, even though Rango didn't have a clear goal in the beginning of the story, his search for his own identity was a subconscious goal he had that led him to actually going through this journey. With that, the film turns a very classic story of what you were searching for was right in front of you the whole time, by creating a protagonist that's incredibly flawed, as he's self-obsessed to the point he'd abandoned the whole town for his own benefit, after lying to all of them, and giving them hope, only to have that protagonist realize his search for self-knowledge leads him right back to the place he abandoned, because he can be the hero he wants to be. But not for him, for the people he owes it to.
No man can walk out on his own story.